Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is the podcast vlog, if you will, where we come to you every week during the legislative session to bring to you what's happened in Olympia, what is happening in Olympia, the impact of state policy, the state policy changes, how these things will impact your life, the way your children are educated, the way your business operates, all of those things. And today we have a very packed show because, of course, the legislative session, at least the regular session, is over. Sine die was Sunday, and they were very busy, passing a lot of things, and we're going to talk about some of them that could hit you in the pocketbook. We're going to start with our senior researcher, Paul Guppy, our former vice president for research, but senior researcher now, Paul Guppy, who has been updating you on the legislative session every week with his very popular videos. Paul, the session is over, but that doesn't mean the impact is over. Why don't you give us your overall impression of the final hours of the session?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Dave. The impact for the rest of us in the state is just starting. So even though the legislative session is ending here at the end of April, the decisions that lawmakers have made and the bills that the governor will be signing are going to affect everybody across the state. And the number one way it's going to impact us is in the pocketbook. So they have decided to really increase the tax burden, the financial burden that lawmakers place on every family, every business and individual in the state. And let me back up and provide some framing and context about how that happened. So this is sort of the hidden tactics that are used in Olympia to prepare the public for the major tax increases that are coming in the next weeks and months. And they started, the Democrats did, all the way back in the fall, before the legislative session started. They began a narrative that the state is billions of dollars short on money, which is not true, objectively not true. But the way they couch it is that there's a budget gap, there's a shortfall. Revenues are not actually going down, which is why they do not use precise technical language. They use vague terms to create an impression that the state is short $12 billion, $15 billion, $9 billion. They throw out these different numbers. It's always huge amounts of money that they are lacking. That's how they put it. When you look at the actual revenues, which is what Washington Policy Center does, we just go straight to the numbers. They are collecting billions of dollars more in revenue under the existing tax code with no policy changes. The Republicans saw that as well. They introduced a balanced budget that increased state spending by about 8% with existing revenues, no cuts, no shortfall, no deficit. They introduced that during the legislative session, and the Democrats voted it down. And the reason is they do not want an alternative narrative that informs the public that it's possible to pay for all the government services we have now, all programs, plus increases at an average of 8% without new taxes. So they put the kibosh on that and then went ahead with their own agenda of increasing taxes, and we can get to those details in a minute.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, and it's one that's been very frustrating to me, which is how I think a lot of Washington is done a disservice by media coverage which went right along the overwhelming bulk of it. I mean, there were a couple of standouts, but right along with this this framing, saying that there's this budget gap, budget deficit. I saw it in story after story after story going along with this idea. And, I know what would be said. They would say, well, it is, look, there's this gap of what they were expecting to spend. We'd be biased to do it any other way. But to me, it shows an inherent bias in the status quo because they're going along with the talking points of the majority that clearly wanted these additional taxes. And you also hit on something that Superintendent Reichdahl did, too. This is another kind of it piggybacks on the tactic you were describing. Remember, Reichdahl said that education funding has gone sharply down in Washington state because the percentage of the overall state budget spent on education is going down, not because actual spending is going down. So it'd be like, if you made $100,000 in your household and suddenly it became $200,000, and you were spending, previously you were spending 50% on tuition for your kids. and then you're only spending 25% on tuition for kids,
Exactly.
suddenly you're underfunding your kids, which is,
Right.
nonsense.
Yeah, so that's one tactic that politicians use, is that they shift the framing or the benchmark to something, a measurement which is entirely arbitrary, which is, you're exactly pointing out. In the real world of students and education in schools, the percentage of the state budget which is spent on education is completely irrelevant. The only thing that matters is, do schools have the resources that they need to operate? And the answer is yes. We are spending more money, more physical dollars on public education than we ever have in the history of the state. It's more than $19,000 per student. I actually think it's higher than that now. So in terms of just providing the resources that are needed for public education, that is there. When a politician like Reichdahl comes out and starts talking about percentages and proportions and different oddball metrics that he just invented, it's clear that he's pushing a kind of an agenda. And back to your point about the media, is that really becomes a kind of dishonesty where they will not explain just let's start with the basic numbers. How much revenue did the state collect last year? How much is it this year? And it's billions of dollars more. So to not even inform people of the basic truth that revenues are rising, and to us as analysts, that's the start of any conversation about the budget. After that, you can make a determination of whether it's enough, or do we have overspending, or have programs expanded. But an understanding of the way the government spends our money has to begin with, what is the basic picture?
So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I was thinking, if there's one person to ask, it's you on this topic, which is, we still got the largest tax increase in Washington State's history, but I think we also, just the amount of new taxes proposed that didn't pass was like would have been a second largest tax increase in history. So we dodged one bullet and hit another.
Yeah, so this is, again, another tactic that is used by politicians, and that is, they put out a disaster scenario, a parade of horribles. I'll give an example at the local level. Whenever there's a levy, a special levy for public services, the message that is put out, if you don't vote for the levy, the public park is going to close, fire stations will be shut down, there won't be any police. And that's the way they started the narrative early in the session, is that we need vastly more taxes, it's horrible things are going to happen. And then they get to the end of the session and they haven't enacted every bad thing that they expected, only some of them. And then it doesn't feel so bad. So they're trying to set expectations with the public that, hey, we dodged a bullet. At least we don't have a wealth tax. At least we don't have a new payroll tax. And that's all to mollify people and kind of put us to sleep to the fact that our tax burden is increasing massively, and it is not justified by the actual finances of the government. And that's the deceptive part.
What tax that did pass disturbs you the most, Paul?
I think it's the increase in the B&O tax, and then the gas tax increases for transportation. Transportation is a different budget. And I'll hit both of those quickly. They're increasing the gas tax by 6 cents a gallon, which is a big increase. And it puts us among the top 3 states for costly gas taxes in the country. But hidden underneath that is they increased the tax on diesel fuel by 12 cents a gallon. And although most of us don't drive diesel cars, but diesel is literally the engine of the economy. Every movement that's made in our economy is driven by diesel fuel, and that will increase the cost of every consumer good, groceries, everything across the board in our state. And then the second one is the increase in B&O taxes, which again feels indirect. It's a gross tax on businesses. They pay it quarterly, kind of behind the scenes. The public doesn't see it. But the way it ripples through the economy is it increases the cost of everything. And lawmakers in Olympia, particularly the Democrats who are in charge, seem completely insensitive to the way that these 2 taxes in particular are going to hit everyone across the state. They talk about affordability, inflation, family budgets. Oh, we need to care about working people and middle income people. And then you look at the way they vote and act, it's completely the opposite.
Yeah, you might not drive a diesel, but everything that you purchased was moved there by a diesel engine in all likelihood, right?
Right.
So with the B&O tax, what do you see the impact on that? Washington already struggles to keep businesses alive over a period of time. And we have a problem when we have businesses start up, it's hard for them to stay in business in Washington State. How do you see this B&O tax impacting that and others who might be considering, whether or not to locate in Washington State?
Yeah, great point. So the reason that we in the Washington Policy Center are so concerned about both the business environment in general, that's regulations and rules, but also just the straight financial burden, is that we think about entrepreneurs and small businesses, family-owned businesses, investments that are coming into the state from other places, because we see those as the engine of the economy, literally. Hundreds of thousands of enterprises that are operating every day in a creative way to serve their customers and make a profit and create jobs. That is the engine of the economy. We hear a lot about high tech, Boeing, aerospace, Amazon. That's all great. And the big corporations, we're in favor of and appreciate the jobs and the creativity that they do. But the actual driver are small businesses and entrepreneurs, enterprises with less than 100, fewer rather than 100 employees, because that's where the creativity is. Those are innovators who are constantly adjusting what they do based on customer feedback. And what increasing the B&O tax does is increase that dollar threshold that an entrepreneur needs every day, every week, in order to make it and stay out of bankruptcy. So the higher that dollar level is, the more that people are shut out of the economy and are not able to run their own business.
How significant do you think some of the rule changes were this year in terms of the legislature? I mean, people forget, the state legislature is not the same as the federal legislature. There's no filibuster where, they could stall forever on item. But traditionally, there has been open floor debate, and the rules were changed this year to shut down a debate for. I mean, it was a 100-year precedent or 100-plus-year precedent, if I remember. So. How significant do you see that?
So that, again, there's an irony here. At the national level, we hear about authoritarianism and we're losing our democracy. And oh my goodness, the national administration is doing these terrible things. And then we look at the way that actions are actually taking in our state legislature locally, and we see the same effect. So in answer to your point, Dave, I would say that those are a symptom of the impatience that the Democrats have with exercising power. When the minority party, Democrats or Republicans, it doesn't matter. I mean, you could even be talking about another country. But when the party in power starts to strip away the words, the platform, the ability, debate time, offering amendments, additional votes, things like these are all process protections. It means that the governing party is becoming impatient with checks and controls on their power. And what that adds up to is, we're doing some unpopular things and we just want to get it through quickly without a lot of debate. And that's what's indicated there.
Speaking of checks and balances on power, it was frustrating to see emergency power reform not go through this year. However, emergency clauses are another problem that the legislature has placed upon the people. And, for the first time, the governor seems open to actually getting rid of some of these things. So first, describe why the emergency clause system is being abused by legislators, and not just this legislature, but for years, this has been an abusive process, and what the change might mean.
Yeah, it shows that it is an abuse of emergency procedure. So an emergency clause is just what it says. It can be it's a sentence that's added to the end of a bill. It causes the bill to go into effect almost immediately, and it prevents the people from repealing it through a referendum in the future. You can still do an initiative. There are technical things there, but the point is it just erodes popular democracy and takes away accountability. And it's to Governor Ferguson's credit that he will veto some of these emergency clauses. It's also to his credit that he was in favor of limiting the governor's emergency executive powers, as we had during the COVID lockdowns, where Inslee, for 975 days, 2.5 years, he exercised emergency executive power Ferguson is in favor of cutting that back. In both cases, it's an indicator of the willingness to abuse power. And that's what's really concerning. The signal that the majority Democrats send is that we are no longer interested in having to explain what we're doing to the public, defend it. We're going to use just raw power in Olympia and drive things through. And that's a tone that I think is most concerning.
We know that some of the bigger efforts to increase property taxes failed, but there are some changes coming to property taxes. Describe what they are.
Well, it's just an incremental increase in the burden. It's like constant baby steps that always move in the same direction, and that is reducing household income, elderly people on limited incomes, first-time home buyers. It just extracts dollars from your pocket. That's what it adds up to. The actual details and mechanism are constantly shifting. So one idea that the Democrats were pushing was to strip away the annual tax cap on how much, it's a 1% limit on how much the total tax burden can go up every year. They were talking about taking that away. They apparently failed at their ability to do that. And then what do? They shift right around to other methods that authorize local governments to increase your taxes, which for all of us results in the same thing. Regardless of what jurisdiction is taking your money, it reduces your household income. And so that's the alternative approach that they took. They kind of did that switch like at the last minute. It was not described from the beginning of the session. And again, that's another indication the Democrats' lack of trust in the public. If this were, openly debated and they were holding press conferences and announcing what they were trying to do and explaining it to try to persuade the public to support it, that's true democracy. When they kind of pull a fast one in the last few days or weeks of the session, behind the scenes, and then spring it on everyone when it's too late to do anything about it, that shows a harsher style of governing that is uninterested in what the public has to say.
Is there a non-budget bill that went through that that caught your attention, good or bad, that you'd like to share?
Okay, well, that might be a long list, but I'll just focus on one. I think the one that's the most problematic is the proposal, and I think Elizabeth is going to cover some of this later, is the UNI unemployment benefits to striking workers, which as a policy organization that we just see in principle is an abuse, because the unemployment payments, unemployment benefits, which date back to like the 1930s, is a concept that everybody can support. Our vibrant capitalist economic system means that sometimes there are winners and losers. People lose their job through no fault of their own, and they need help for a while in order to get back on their feet. And even the most ardent capitalist supports that system. It's a good idea. Now the Democrats want to shift that to make it unemployment benefits for voluntary action like strikes. It's a kind of graft to the unions, because now they can tap the state treasury to support their labor disputes. And it's really a misuse of what that program was set up to be. And the last point I'll make about it is practical, and that is, do you want to have more labor disputes in your economy? Then reward the union and, give them money to go on strike. And that's what we're going to see in the future.
Why save for a strike fund if you've got the state doing it for you, And by the way, you're having other people working to pay into that for you. That struck me as, I don't think there's, I'm trying to think if there's any other piece of legislation that better illustrates the problem between public sector unions and striking, because the management in the private sector, management is on the opposite side of the fence. They have conflicting interests and they can negotiate fairly. In the public sector, you have the quote unquote management side, which is the politicians who don't have their own money invested, siding with the people that give them their campaign dollars and donations and get them elected and volunteer for their campaigns. And they'll openly march with them, side with them, and then they're the ones at the negotiating table, on behalf of the taxpayers, which is a different thing. So I think even FDR recognized that was not a fair system. And this is like the exclamation point on that, I think.
Exactly. In the private sector, I mean, we support unions in the sense that there's freedom of association. If workers want to get together and form an association, a union to protect their economic interests, that's a constitutional and human right number one.
Mhm.
And it's also practical because you want people to be able to talk to each other and resolve disputes with management. That's all fine. As you point out, in the private sector, management and workers are two parties in a dispute, but there's always the marketplace. The consumer is the check that if the company is not run profitably, it's going to go out of business. The government is entirely different. And what Franklin Roosevelt pointed out is that in the public sector, the management or the boss is the people themselves. It's the public. And when politicians sell out the interests of the public because of their friends who are unions, help elect them, there's like a cycle. The union elects the governor negotiates with the unions for a collective bargaining contract, and the union gets more money. So in the public sector, that power dynamic doesn't make sense, and you don't have the normal market competitive check where the general public, the consumer, is weighing in to make sure that it's efficient and everyone is treated fairly.
Well, next week we'll be covering the transportation budget in detail. We'll go in depth with Charles Prestrude. However, I did want to ask you very quickly, since we touched on the gas tax, what was it, 6 cents for gas? How much was it for diesel?
12 cents a gallon.
12 cents a gallon for diesel.
Big increase.
Plus you have the Climate Commitment Act tax continuing with what earlier this year the auction indicated a 40 cent per gallon increase, and that's in gas, more for diesel. Again, was there any movement on the road usage charge?
Yeah, there was encouraging movement in the sense that it died, an ignominious failure. So great. But this is like the fourth or fifth time that has happened. There is an ongoing pressure campaign in Olympia. The chairman of the Transportation Committee, Democrat, is very much in favor of this, had different versions and permutations that he was pushing through the session. And once again, it failed, and they didn't get that. So that's good news for the public that we will not be paying a mileage charge and all the complications and problems that come along with that. But what's discouraging is they just won't give up on this idea. No matter how much the public weighs in and says, we do not want a mileage tax. What part about no do you not understand? And yet they just circle back and push it again. So the mileage tax will be back next year, and Democrats are going to try to create conditions in order to push that through.
Yeah, you're not kidding. It's been around over and over and over again. It's like they're waiting for that one time when they're able to squeak it through, and then they'll say, "Well, the debate's over."
Exactly, no more discussion.
Yeah, let's not discuss this any further. Is there any other issue that kind of rises to a level where you want people to know about it right now, and we need to keep them informed before I let you go, Paul?
Well, I think the main issue is what I started out with, which is I think the main educational thing we're trying to get across to the public is the general framing about the state of our public finances. Revenues are rising. There is no need for the government to increase the financial burden and taxes on us. We encourage people to let their elected representatives know that the public is not buying this idea of that there's some automatic shortfall. The result is because of overspending, decisions that are made by lawmakers, and it's completely legitimate for the public to push back and say, why are you raising my taxes when you don't have to? And I think that's the kind of question that lawmakers should be prepared to answer.
I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that in the next legislative session, there is going to be a quote unquote crisis of revenue.
Point.
And we're gonna need some more revenue to handle that crisis.
Yeah, good point. It'll be a familiar message, and we should all be very skeptical when we hear that story again.
Okay, well, thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dave.
Yeah. All right, so now we're going to turn to our Center for Small Business Director, Mark Harmsworth, and we'll talk with Mark about, Mark, you're missing your WPC logo background of all things there. But I will forgive you this once. What is the situation on rent control? I saw it passed in the final day. What was the nature of the bill that passed, and how bad was it?
Well, I am missing my background because I'm being taxed too much and I can't afford to put it up anymore. So rent control, for those folks that don't know what it's about, basically it's putting a cap on the amount that a property owner can increase their rent. And since the majority of property owners in the state are small business owners, it can create some significant issues. The biggest issue, though, is on one hand, you've got the government that can arbitrarily, as we've now seen this year, increase taxes, putting pressure on the bottom of the equation, effectively the operational costs of the rental properties. And on the top side, they're now saying, hey, we're going to limit you to, and the conference bill that was voted on was 7% plus CPI on the top side. And so you end up in a situation where rental property, you maybe you need a new roof, maybe you got to replace appliances, maybe you have a water leak and you got to do water damage. And now the property owners facing a large bill, they have to recoup that money. They can't just remortgage everything again. And now they can't increase the rents. And understandably, we're trying to make affordable housing here in this state, but this is not the way to do it. What you do is you increase the supply by reducing the regulations and the barriers to creating new homes. And you've seen this across the US. Other states that reacted to this in the last few years are building like crazy, and they're seeing the house prices there. Just go look at other states. Their house prices are not increasing as fast as Washington, and in some cases staying steady because they have good supply. And what this rent control thing will give, this rent control bill will give folks initially is a good feeling. Hey, my rent didn't go up too much, and then the apartment goes offline because the property owner can't afford to run it anymore, and decreases the supply, and suddenly all the rents go up.
How would it work if, let's say, somebody moved out of an apartment with the landowner, then I'm trying to avoid landlord because it makes it kind of sound like this class warfare thing, but the landowner, could they then raise the rate to whatever they wanted? Or is it, in other words, is the rent control dependent on a tenant, or does it matter?
Well, one of the provisions, and I don't think it made it into the final bill, but one of the provisions is that the property owner can't increase the rent within a year of the tenant leaving. I don't think that made it in, but that shows you where the heads are at. The folks that are pushing this is because that's what would ultimately happen. The roof fails, the property owner comes into the tenant and says, sorry, I've got to raise the rent $300 a month because I've got to buy a new roof and replace it. And the tenant says, I can't afford it. So market, demand, supply, they move out. And then the property owner increases the rent by $300 to cover the cost of the roof, and you get a new tenant in. And the new tenant may be more willing or capable of paying that, or maybe it's not a roof, maybe it's new appliances, new carpets, new paint, and all the types of things that go on, improvements to the property that make it a more rent attractive property, so he can demand more, she can demand more rent for that property. So you could see that happening. And that's ultimately what I think is going to happen here is you'll see a lot more 1-year leases. Some of the penalties that are put on, and this one's particularly egregious, is the 6-month notification on anything over 3%. Because if the roof fails at month 7 and you walk in there at month 4 and say, I've got to replace the roof, you didn't give 6 months notice, and therefore the tenant can walk out, and there's all sorts of penalties and lost lease revenue, and it just costs the property owner even more. And you will find that some people just say, it's not worth the risk. I'm going to take my dollars and I'm going to invest in rental property in other states where I'm not going to get this kind of a problem happen, or that level of risk. The other thing, and this is the way I would think about it, is I look at the cost of having to replace the roof and the major appliances, the furnaces and those types of things, particularly if it's a home and not just an apartment or a duplex. And I would factor that replacement cost into the rent over a 10-year or 20-year period based on the life expectancy of the water tank or whatever. And what will that do? Well, that increases the cost of the rent. So what you're going to see, I think, now this is passed, is a increase in rent on new properties. Existing properties will probably stay flat or just go up by the maximum amount, in this case 7% plus CPI, because they have to reduce the risk of potential failures that they have to cover at some point in the future. So they have to build a little nest up to replace those water heaters, those furnaces, and those roofs.
That's what kind of scares me about this is once they've established this pattern. So now in order to protect themselves, you'll have people raising the rent to all the time, every time. Because unlike the government, which gives themselves banking capacity on property tax increases, so they can increase it more later when they want it. When it comes to private owners, if something happens and they need to pay for repairs, if they haven't built in these increases automatically, they could be left, having to take it out of their pocket, which would be a problem for a lot of owners. So, there's some irony in that the bill itself could end up stirring even more calls for more rent control because it will inevitably lead to higher rents.
Yeah, and if they go down that road, it just makes the whole situation worse. I'm hearing from other friends about development in the state. This doesn't just affect existing rental properties. It affects companies that are coming in and building apartments because they're looking at it going, well, I've got probably a 2 or 3 year lead if I'm already permitted before I can even start renting these things. People forget this. If you build a property for rent, you're not seeing any revenue until that first renter moves in and it reaches the target occupancy that you're looking to do in. So there's this investment you make up front of money, and it's not just some people are borrowing this money, so they're paying interest on it, and then finally you get the renters in. There's no stability in the market because these property owners who are property developers who are trying to build more apartments to increase the supply to reduce our costs say, hey, it's too unstable. I don't know what the market's going to look like in 3 years when my apartment complex finally comes online, well, my fourplex duplex or whatever, and they don't know, so they're pulling out. And I'm hearing this. I've heard of one already that's already pulled out several hundred apartments that they're not going to build now because they don't like the stability of Washington State anymore. They can't project, because for some of these folks it is investment and they're literally looking at the numbers. They say, I put this much money in, I expect to get this much money out, here's my contingency and here's my profit, and we move on. But now they're like, well, that profit could get wiped out, so why would I take the risk?
There were a couple of things that you've written about, Mark, that were actually good news, or relatively good news, where there was some efforts to try to make housing easier to supply, to try to deal with some of our housing shortage issues. Can you address a couple of those for us?
Yeah, I've just written down some of the things here. There was 1935, which does some exemptions on house permits. Again, that's to speed that and create that stability in the construction of new homes and apartments and stuff. 1757, this was kind of interesting. It allows some residential construction within commercial zones. So think about sort of when they do redevelopments of downtown cores where they've traditionally been more commercial. I think with that, the proof's going to be in the pudding. I think conceptually it's a good idea, but I want to see how it gets built out. You want nice apartments. You don't want to end up with Soviet-style blocks that we're starting to see pop up around the light rail stations now because of the urban development guidelines, which they did push through this year. And there were some B&O tax exceptions for small business on cap gains as well, capital gains. So that's where you're not double taxed on both capital gains, and then you pay B&O tax on the capital gains. So that was a good thing as well. And I think the housing, I think there is a realization that our permitting process is too complex. We've been shouting this from the mountain for the last few years. Going through some of these processes myself, I've seen the idiocy of just even trying to get a water permit for a well required 3 different permits and several $1,000s. So if we can streamline this in any way and reduce the cost, because if you're a home developer and maybe you buy a 1 acre or 2 acre lot and you subdivide it, and there's some good stuff around lot splitting that's come in as well to allow you to use your land the way that you want to, given the restrictions of maybe your zoning in your neighborhood. But if you want to do this, if you start adding in $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 worth of permit fees, that cost, back to my original comment about how much is this going to cost, what's my investment, what's my return, that cost gets thrown straight at the property owner. So it just drives up the cost of housing, which is primarily one of the big drivers of the cost of housing in Washington specifically.
Was there any movement on the estate tax that impacts small business this year?
Not that I'm aware of, nothing significant. The biggest issue for our small businesses this year really was the B&O taxes. They did update some of the estate tax margins. But the big one we've talked about with Mr. Guppy earlier was the B&O taxes. And then the other one was application of sales tax to new service industries. So if you're in the IT business, web development business, or anything like that, previously you didn't have to pay sales taxes. Now you're going to be paying sales taxes on those activities. It was a very complex calculation anyway, because it depended on nexus, whether you touched the device, whether it was just education. And many folks just charge sales tax anyway, but they're projecting significant money to come from that. It's I think it's the 5th or 6th highest tax in state history. It's coming from that sales tax, new sales tax is being added there. The B&O tax is actually a huge increase. And again, that cost will be passed on to the consumer. So I would expect to see some significant costs. And don't forget, the business and occupation tax, B&O, is on gross revenue, not on net. So you may operate $1 million business and lose $100,000 in your first 5 years. You're still paying, in the IT industry's case, 2.1% B&O tax on that $1 million. So over $20,000 in taxes on that. So that's a significant increase. I, as you know, own a small business, and over the last 5 to 6 years, I've seen a 1,000% increase in the B&O taxes that I'm paying, partially because the company grew, but mostly because my B&O tax rate has gone from below 0.5 to 2.1%.
Crazy. And I know the budget's very complicated, it's very thick, so and it's not like they give you a little extra time, or the public extra time to go through it and make sure everybody's happy with it. These things happen very quickly at the end of session in order to get out of Dodge before opposition has a chance to really organize themselves again with any specificity. So I'm sure we'll be talking more about what happened in this legislature in the weeks to come. Mark, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, and good luck with that $93 billion they just threw at us.
Thank you. All right, now let's turn to Elizabeth New. Elizabeth has been covering worker rights and healthcare, and there's been some overlap with healthcare and education. Let's start with the big changes in the Parental Bill of Rights, Elizabeth, where there's some changes in the obligations for school employees and students. Why don't you describe what happened for us?
Well, Initiative 2081 was passed last year by the legislature. If you remember, it was an initiative that had nearly 500,000 signatures, and it asked that parents be notified before when schools know about medical issues or mental health issues facing their kids, or arranging care for them, and knowledge about these areas. And what these bills, 1296 and 5181, I think 1296 is the one that made it all the way through, does is it takes those parent notification rights away, saying that student privacy rights are more important. So that means that parents will not know when schools and educators know about or help arrange or direct students to medical or mental health services.
Yeah, I find that deeply disturbing there. It's also interesting to me that the state, when it comes to foster parents, there's obligations to report everything, right? So when the state is acting as the parent, they expect everything to be reported, even if somebody is left in even if they leave children in other people's charge. You're reporting, if there's an accident, if there's any medical needs, all of that has to go into weekly reports, and they're checked up on. But now with parents, the state's taking the opposite approach, where, when parents send their children to school, then suddenly there's this, Jedi mind trick where they're not supposed to need to know about these things, based usually on some extreme where some parents, are abusive to their kids, or don't, but what it really comes down to me is, in the argument, seems to be that some parents don't project the attitude that the state likes, and therefore the state would rather have the power to make these calls with students than leave them to parents. And I find that to be a deeply disturbing attitude among advocates of this position.
Yeah, that's what's going on here. And even though lawmakers danced around the issue and said, schools notify me, notify parents if they are given aspirin at school, and yes, we are. But if your child wants, let's say, an abortion or STD services or birth control or things like gender transition services, that's where this is coming up. And students' privacy rights are being prioritized above parents' rights. And the biggest problem I had with this bill is that this is not safe for children to be given medical services or mental health treatment without the people who see them most of the time and who have their best interest at heart, even knowing it's going on if someone else knows. You know, teens in our state already have the right to seek out things like abortion or gender transition services and that kind of stuff without their parents' consent or knowledge. And that wouldn't have been threatened. Still, children would still be able to seek that out without parents' consent or knowledge. But it wouldn't have the school being an accomplice. And that's how I see this. Another concern is that, you know, you're in some cases having kids seek out mental health or medical service from people who are not trained caregivers. That's not safe, and it's not appropriate. So our state has robust abuse laws. Educators are mandatory reporters, and they should be. If they see an abusive situation or they're told by a student, I want to tell you stuff, but you know, I'm in an abusive home, they have to report, and then CPS and services can come in and help that student immediately. So those things are in place. This was about keeping parents out of the loop when kids are seeking mental health services or having medical services arranged for them at school or during the school day. Kids can even leave campus without their parents' knowledge for certain health services. So it's a concerning approach, and I felt like lawmakers danced around the issue the whole session and didn't speak candidly about this and acted like it wasn't a problem. It is a problem. There are surveys happening in schools too, where private information is being shared with third parties. That hasn't been addressed. Lawmakers have been made aware of it by me, by others, and I didn't see any result in the legislation handling some of those privacy concerns.
Well, there's a trust issue too. Parents, you know, give their children, they turn over their children to the teachers with a trust there that they're placeholders. They're not there forever. And as much as I loved my teachers, and I did, I'm friends with some of them still, and remember them fondly throughout, you know, kindergarten through high school, and on through college. They're not your parents, and they're not there for you every day of your life. And you know, they're someone who is with you in a special way for part of that journey, but they're not the ones with the high stakes. And that's who the parents are. The parents are with you thick or thin through the rest of your life. And that's why these huge life-altering decisions, you know, whether it's uncomfortable or not, that's why parents have to be there for them. We have a quick question for you. Can schools and individual districts have discretion on or around this policy?
No, in fact, the bill that passed, 1296, took on preemptive situation where a school board or a school district didn't line up with the state on keeping parents in the dark. And it says for willful non-compliance of state law, which this will be, schools face a 20% monetary penalty. Rules are being written up talking about what willful non-compliance is and who will be subject to the penalties.
It's fascinating because I remember not so many years ago, in fact, I think it was last year and the year before and the year before, whenever something comes up, there's the cry of local control, you know, and especially when it came to the McCleary Compromise, there was all kinds of cries about, oh my gosh, you know, we've got to have local control here. But then when push comes to shove on key policies that are impacting children directly, not just financing, but on the rest of these issues, suddenly local control is thrown out the window if it doesn't conform with what the desire is from the top down, which is disturbing. We're very short on time, Elizabeth, so I want to turn attention very quickly to the paid family medical leave, which we've brought up a number of times on the program here. Where did it end up? And are we going to see the payroll tax increase for the paid family medical leave?
Well, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is we didn't get as much of an increase as we could have. So right now, paid family medical leave, we pay out of our taxes. In 2019, all W-2 workers, it started at 0.4%. It's now at 0.92%. It has more than doubled. And there's a 1.2% rate cap. So when this bill started out, Senate Bill 5292, it proposed changing the way we set the rate for the next year. They wanted it to be based on actuarial findings about how many people would be taking advantage of the program. So that's sort of defensible, only kind of, because it just makes them look like they're not unable to meet the program's needs. So that would have helped them in that way, but they also wanted to get rid of the cap. Well, that bill got changed. The cap was reinstated. It wasn't going to change the cap of 1.2%, which we're expected to be paying next year, or the year after. I can't remember exactly. But then the bill went over to the House, and a lawmaker put in a provision. I had pointed out that even with the new actuarial look at who gets how much the rate is, we were going to not be able to pay for the paid family medical leaves way as long as that price cap was in place. So I was kind of pointing it out, hoping that more lawmakers would be like, wow, this program can't pay its way. It's hurting low-income workers because they're having to pay part of their wages to people with higher incomes to meet life needs and wants. In fact, people making 60 or more an hour are using this program at more than twice the rate as the lowest income group. So the lawmaker changed it, said, oh, this is going to be in trouble again, even with our changes on how we set the rate. So we're going to go ahead and bust the cap, and it's going to rise to 2% by 2033. So $2 of every $100, when this thing started out at 40 cents per $100. It didn't pass, but I think it will be back. This program does not pay its way, and they need to find a way to get more from workers for it.
I had an interesting conversation with someone who had just moved to the state, and they said, oh, I really like this paid family medical leave. And I said, well, did you know that higher income people tend to get the benefit more? So it's actually a transfer of wealth from lower income people to higher income people because they still can't afford to take the time off at a fraction of their pay, but higher income people can. So it ends up being lower income people subsidizing upper income people for this instead of prioritizing savings or something along those lines. As much as and as sympathetic as I am to the idea, and they're like, "What? That happens?" I said, "Yeah." And also, it started off as as 40 cents on the dollar, and already it's doubled and tripled, and they're looking for this new level. And there's no limit to payroll taxes, right? I mean, do we have a cap in Washington State that says you can only pay this percentage of your income on a payroll tax, or is that just an open-ended field right now?
It's open-ended right now, and my worry is that it will become the vehicle of revenue for any issue that they can't pass through the general fund budget. Look, if this is a priority to us, same thing with wild cares. If it's a priority for us to, hurt low-income workers so that everyone can have a program, if that's a priority to us, then we shouldn't be penalizing workers. We shouldn't be penalizing work. And it's going to get really hard to say we don't have an income tax when right now we might.
When so much of your income is going to be stripped away before you even get it.
Right.
It's the almost income tax.
Right.
Never even got it for the income. Crazy. Yeah. Elizabeth, we're totally out of time, but I know we have a lot more to talk about with you, which we will do in the weeks to come. And I'm sure you'll be learning more about the budget because it takes a while to understand and grasp all the different things that have passed over the last couple of days. And I want to thank you for coming on again and for your hard work, breaking records, by the way, for those who didn't know, in terms of WPC researchers asked to testify. Elizabeth was basically a testimony machine, being asked to testify numerous times in the legislature. How many times was it total? 16?
16, but some of those were in writing, and
That
those
counts.
a
That
few
counts.
were in writing because they only give 1 minute and they run out of time. So sometimes you don't get to speak, but I'm so lucky to be part of that process and hopefully say something new that a fence sitter has not heard before or considered. That's the goal.
Well, thank you for your time today. I appreciate
Yeah.
it. See you again soon.
All right.
One final note before I close the show today, that is, earlier I referred to the excise tax, and I got a text from one of you saying it's the death tax. It's the death tax. I stand corrected. The death tax, the generational wealth punishment tax, the rob from the grieving tax, whatever you want to call it, it is an unfair and ridiculous tax on things that have already been taxed many, many times. And it's sad that it exists at all. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be with you next Tuesday when we'll take a look in depth at the transportation budget that passed. If you enjoyed the show and you want to see portions of it again, be sure to check out our YouTube channel. Or if you know someone who would appreciate the legislative update we provided today, you can send them to our YouTube channel because we'll be posting this one here shortly. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.